Hey guys, so what I'm going to do is review this rhetorical analysis with you. We're going to read through it, and then I'm going to open up a sample essay that I've written that basically does a rhetorical analysis. I'm going to point out to you the different pieces of it that you would want to make sure you have in yours. So here we are, AP English Language and Composition, free response, Q2, which we know is our prose analysis practice. I gave 30 minutes when I used to assign this in class. Here's the prompt. The passage below is an excerpt from Dorothy Allison's article, Panacea, in which she discusses her mother's cooking and how her cooking represents a much greater point about economic inequality. Read the passage carefully. Then write an essay in which you analyze Allison's mode of rhetoric and the strategies she uses to convey her deeper interpretation of food and poverty. So we know right away that food and poverty are going to be key ideas inside this piece. We know Panacea, if you weren't familiar with what Panacea is, but it's a cure-all. It's something that should cure any disease or problem. And we see that Dorothy Allison is going to be talking about her mother's cooking. So all those points are definitely going to be kind of important to us. If we're thinking about the rhetorical situation, she's definitely being pulling this memory and this argument out from thinking about food and the way that people eat and interpret food. So here we go. My mother's gravy was a savory country gravy, heavy on the black pepper. Best of all was steak, cube steak. People call it country fried steak, but Mama always called it cube steak. She began with odd indented slabs of cheap meat carried home from the diner where she was on her feet all day. My sisters and I would pound the steak while she rested. The little round mouth of the Coke bottle thudded into meat over and over until each piece was not only dimpled but flattened out half again, as wide as it had been. By the time Mama stopped us, the steaks would be tenderized almost to pieces. Then she would shoo us out of the way, make up the biscuits, and sift some of the flour onto a plate. Dredged in flour, the steaks went into a hot cast iron skillet with a good covering of bacon fat. So long as we set the table and were useful, we were allowed to watch Mama cook the steaks and then set them aside on a brown paper bag. Then she took the plate of leftover flour and sprinkled it in the pan, stirring it as it browned, and the pan filled with little brown flour pebbles and charred bits of meat. A lot of water and a little milk made steam rise up in a sweet cloud. Mama worked with the gravy with a fork until all was smooth and silky. She might pour the gravy over the steaks, or she might serve it in a bowl. It was not until I was grown that I understood that gravy poured over the meat before it came to the table meant there was not much meat. In one tract house or another, first in South Carolina and then Florida, where we moved when I was a teenager, Mama made magic with cheap meat, flour, and determination, hiding from us how desperate things might be. She did such a good job of it that we came to believe cube steak a luxury, better than the rare T-bone our uncles might bring around as a surprise. Okay, so what you'll notice inside this piece, if we were to note the ideas of food and poverty, is that there are always going to be correlations being made between the food and the memory and the reality of it. So for me, one of the major points that I would want to address inside analyzing this is that there is a contrast between the reality of cheap meat, of, like it says, a lot of water and a little milk, lots of gravy, right? That those things that she grew up loving and having a fondness for, this nostalgia for, are actually examples of inequity and poverty within food, and how food can be used as a signifier for those things. If we were to talk about her tone, right, she's definitely nostalgic. I notice a lot of words that she's using to bring out that nostalgia and also the personality of it, right? But Mama always called it cube steak. By the time Mama stopped us, the steaks would be tenderized almost to pieces. Then she would shoo us out of the way. But notice that informal tone that invokes a familiarity with all of this, which is definitely going to be fairly important to reading this. And, her purpose is definitely to show how her mother was using food in a way to mask their own hard conditions, right? And what Dorothy Allison is showing through this is the way that reality and our memory may differ, may not always show us the same kind of points about poverty, and how memory can sometimes reshape what the reality may have been. Okay, so what we're gonna do. So we've talked a little bit about it. Definitely, there's some key ideas up in here, right? So if I was going to look at how does she create this argument about food and poverty and the inequity in it, and how oftentimes we use whatever we have to mask the more obvious poverty that we experience, especially to our children, I would focus on the imagery. I think the imagery is very important. And she goes in, and this is literally her getting close to writing a recipe, if we were to understand where this came from. Right, the country fried steak, cube steak, right? The odd indented slabs of cheap meat carried home from the diner where she was on her feet all day, right? That image is very pointed, definitely reflects the mother's poverty, or not poverty, but definitely lower income and lower middle class at the least, if not lower class. Her working all day long on her feet. The fact that the meat is odd indented slabs of cheap meat, basically the leftovers from the diner that they didn't want to use. Over here, I would probably point out the little round mouth of the Coke bottle. It's important to me that they're using the Coke bottle and not some kind of tenderizer. And as we keep on going through, right, sift some of the flour into a plate, dredged in flour. The steaks went to a hot cast iron skillet with current bacon fat. Once again, the bacon fat being something used to kind of cover up the cheapness of the meat. Right, that we use a brown paper bag to let the steaks soak in. Once again, making use of what's around. So those images are all really important. Yeah, a lot of water and a little milk. Once again, the use of water as opposed to milk, kind of invoking the fact that they were using what they could, what they can use a lot of. And then, of course, we had this epiphany moment that Dorothy Allison has to kind of reflect on that. In the next paragraph, right, she invokes the kind of transient nature of their lives, right, in one tract house or another, first in South Carolina, then Florida. Mama made magic with cheap meat, flour, and determination. So these things, right, are the nostalgic memory. And then this is the reality, right, how desperate things might be. Okay. So what I'm going to go to now is I'm going to show you so when I would assign, this is what it would usually look like, which is why it looked a little funny as far as the line numbers and all that. And usually you're going to see your prose analysis look like this in 2 columns, broken up like this. If it's online, again, it might be a little different. As of right now, we're planning on it being similar to the way it had been traditionally, where we would see it very much in this same format. Okay. What I really want to show you is the essay. Okay. So in introduction, right, we're going to want to make sure that we create some way of introducing the themes and the topic, move into that. I want to make sure I tag the piece, that I give a sense of what her message is, and then that I clearly approach choices that she is making to deliver that rhetoric, right? So here's our introduction. Food is the way many of us remember things. The sensory overload of a good meal becomes the image in our minds of a happy meal, a rough patch in a relationship, or the family we love and celebrate. In her article, Panacea, Dorothy Allison nostalgically reflects on how food can cover the rough truth of poverty. Through her use of images, particularly of her mama making cube steak, Allison contrasts the reality of her family's economic situation with the magic her mother was able to create with the bare minimum. Her anecdotal storytelling creates a sense of the relatability of her experiences, connecting the reader to her more intimately as she shows her mother's cooking process create a shield from the harshness of the real world. Okay. So the very first line, right, just a general statement about food and memory, the idea of the sensory overload of a good meal, what it can bring to our memories. But this was a very general kind of way of introducing the topic, but it provides a path into the deeper discussion. As she goes in, right, in her article Panacea, Dorothy Allison nostalgically reflects. Notice that I put the tone in right away. Nostalgically reflects. That way I can bring up that tone throughout the rest of the argument. I've already brought that up as one of the strategies being used, even though I'm not as direct about that. And of course, I brought up the main message. Food can cover the rough truth of poverty. I talk about imagery through her use of images, particularly for mama making cube steak, and contrast. I talk about right here too. Allison contrasts the reality of her family's economic situation with the magic her mother was able to create with the bare minimum. To continue with other choices that she makes, right, her anecdotal storytelling, right? So as I know I'm going to talk about the way that she's relating to the audience, this also touches a little bit on the rhetorical situation, right? Where it talks about connecting to the reader to her more intimately as she shows her mother's cooking process. And then we go back to the earlier point about what this means. So while it's spread out, it covers the thesis point, addresses the primary theme, and delves into the major choices that are used, and that all of this follows a line of reasoning, which is this single idea of memory and food and its ability to maybe shield us from the idea of poverty and the harshness of the real world. So this contrast is going to be part of our line of reasoning. Okay. In the first body paragraph, you can see that in this particular essay, the process that I used is to move from the beginning to the ending of Dorothy Allison's piece. There are two different ways you can do rhetorical analysis. You can do it that way, or you can do it device by device. And either one works. One is not better than the other. It just kind of depends on what it is that you're writing and how the essay flows for you. So first body paragraph. After starting her essay from her adult vantage, describing her mother's gravy, Allison quickly moves into nostalgic remembrance of herself as a child, watching her mama make a family favorite, cube steak. One tactic that Allison uses is jarring the perspective by placing a contrasting real image beside the innocent, somewhat oblivious vision of the child Allison. For example, the meat is cheap and leftover from the diner where Allison's mother was on her feet all day. Young Allison does not recognize the sign of poverty, but instead shows her excitement as she and her sisters pound the steak with the round mouth of the Coke bottle. To the reader, these clues of poverty are obvious. No fancy culinary tools are being used. Instead, Allison and her sisters must make do with what is available. Of course, they're not perturbed by this predicament. Actually, they're excited. Allison describes that so long as we set the table and we're useful, we're allowed to watch Mama cook the steaks. Allison and her sisters find the experience of watching their mother cook a reward in itself, and they are never disturbed by the brown paper bag or leftover flour or even the lot of water and little milk used for the gravy. These images are shown by Allison simply to relate to the reader the reality, but the nostalgic childhood perspective shows how this food preparation masks the harshness of their lives. Food can be, as the title suggests, a cure-all. So you can see here that there's a clear purpose of showing the author's intentionality. So one tactic that Allison uses And not only does it start talking about the images, but it talks about contrasting the images, right? Imagery, and consequently, contrast of imagery is a rhetorical choice here, developed in depth with continual train of insights as the paragraph continues. So the idea of young Allison does not see this. The reader does see this. We're bringing in the rhetorical situation. You see all of the quotes. The cheap, the diner where Allison's mother was on her feet all day, the pound the steak with the round mouth of the Coke bottle, all these details being plucked out. Allison describes that so long as we set the table and are useful, we're allowed to watch Mama cook the steak. Don't be afraid to use quotes if they're appropriate. And of course, this proves the inference that was being made before. And you always want to make sure you're proving things and talking about it and basically teaching the reader what you see and what you're analyzing. And of course, it goes back to that theme, the line of reasoning started at the beginning of the essay. Next paragraph, Allison shifts back into the adult perspective as she shares her later epiphany that gravy poured over the meat before it came to the table meant there was not much meat. So that epiphany is important. As she closes out the excerpt, Allison gives some brief details that further remind us of the shifting and transient life she grew up with as she moved from one tract house or another from South Carolina to Florida. Her point, though, about the ability of food to mean more gets brought forward once again as she explains how Mama made magic with cheap meat, flour, and determination, hiding from us how desperate things might be. Food and its preparation can be used as a way to mask the inequalities that exist in the world, the fact that Allison is related to the reader in this excerpt. So once again, bring it back to the reader, bring it back to the rhetorical situation, looking at the shifts, once again, a purposeful reminder that Dorothy Allison is making intentional shifts in the essay. The details, notice the specificity of these details that are being used, and the contrast that she's making. So always do that and always relate it back to that line of reasoning, that there is inequality that exists and that food is a way to hide that. Okay. And then just to close it, Dorothy Allison utilizes an informal, nostalgic tone as she presents the reader with images from her childhood. These images of her mother's food preparation show both the reality of their impoverished lives and the magical presentation a parent's loving food preparation can suggest to a child. She admiringly describes the simple cube steak that hid the harsh truth from her naive young eyes. So tone and imagery are both brought back in and shown, once again, this single line of reasoning. It brings it all together. And of course, I wrote this in that 30-minute block that was talked about in the very beginning. If I had more time, I probably would have developed this a little differently. And I wrote it on the cusp. So while I was pulling these things and writing this together, it is that first draft. It doesn't have the kind of refinement that you would expect in some of the essays I'm hoping that you guys will be able to write. Okay, so that is just a brief kind of look and overview at how to do a rhetorical analysis. Please use that as your example, and good luck writing the Northrop Frye piece about social myth making. I'm a big fan of it. Thanks, guys.